Hi everybody, this is Mr. Smith and we're going to talk a little bit about Standard 8.9.5, which is all the compromises from the states' rights issue all the way through the Lincoln-Douglas debates. So let's start here. Like my little squirrel, he's kind of funny looking, isn't he? Okay, let's talk a little bit about states' rights. If you look over here on the right, it says states' rights doctrine was drawn to protect the rights and powers of states against those of the federal government. A lot of times people are too worried about the federal government taking too much power. And so back in this, in our early history, everybody was hoping and praying that the states would just retain their power and the federal government would just kind of sit back and protect us and have an army and a navy and monitor our business. Okay? But as history shows, the doctrine has been invoked by states in every section of the country where they felt their jurisdiction was threatened, whether it was Connecticut or the Midwest, or especially in South Carolina. We talked about nullification, we talked about Andrew Jackson and Henry and John C. Calhoun and the doctrine of nullification during the debate over the tariff abominations. And so, again, this is an issue that's gone back, all the way back really to Thomas Jefferson, who came up with the idea of nullification back in the early 1800s. And one extreme case you see down here is the states' rights doctrine was in 1860 and 61. 11 southern states carried the states' rights to the point of seceding from the Union. This, again, started our Civil War. Okay? But it's generally agreed that states have a jurisdiction which the federal government has no right to invade. Things like education, or certain types of taxes, and property taxes, and states really decide how voting is to take place, and when voting is going to happen, with the exception of the national debates, elections, and that take place in the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Okay, so that's, again, states' rights is a really important doctrine that came along, and it's been bothering people. And if you pay attention to what's going on in the world today, they really do talk about things like Rand Paul and the libertarians talking about what this federal government should and should not do. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Henry Clay. We mentioned him before. Remember, he was the guy that Andrew Jackson really didn't like, and again, one of his regrets in history was not shooting Henry Clay. But Henry Clay is often referred to as the great compromiser. He gave us a lot of opportunities to settle disputes. Again, he outlasted Andrew Jackson, and again, he was one of the most respected politicians in Washington for many, many years. Okay, the Missouri Compromise is one of Henry Clay's ideas, or he was an important member of. Okay, if you read out, the Missouri Compromise is born out of Missouri's application for the admission to the Union. At the time, the United States House of Representatives was dominated by slave and free states, or slave-free states, which were basically northern states, ones that outlawed slavery, while the Senate had a balance of 22 senators each from the slave-free states and the slave states. Because of the fear that the balance might be broken by the statehood of Missouri as a slave state, the Senate defeated Representative James Talmadge's amendment, enabling Missouri to become a state. During the next session of Congress, Maine applied for admission to the Union. Then one slave state and one free state would not threaten the balance in the Senate. So Jesse Thomas of Illinois introduced the Missouri Compromise into the Senate, and it was adopted by Congress in March of 1820. Again, Maine is going to be admitted as a slave-free state, basically a free state. Slavery would be outlawed in the state of Maine, and authorized Missouri to form a state constitution before it could become a state. Now, Missouri, when they first started, again, because you can read here, Missouri didn't want any free blacks or mulattoes, which are mixed race individuals, to enter the state. But Congress wasn't going to go for that. And that Congress decided that before Missouri could be admitted, Henry Clay had to get together with some people and come up with an addition to the compromise, often referred to as the Second Missouri Compromise. And Missouri was required to write a constitution that would allow black citizens into their state. And again, in 1821, Missouri is going to be added to the Union. Okay? And if we move ahead here, we're going to see that under the Missouri Compromise, Alabama and Illinois have just been admitted to the Union prior to the Missouri Compromise. James Talmadge of New York proposes the compromise should alter its constitution to be a free state. Objection to the 3/5 clause, which we talked about early on. The 3/5 compromise was when slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person towards population and taxation in the South or in the country. Henry Clay is going to broker 2 compromises. Okay, the Thomas Amendment was accepted by a 36-30 vote. Okay, and again, talking about slavery as an issue in the national political scene, and it's going to continue for many, many years to come. Okay, as you can see here, this is what this was decided. Okay, that Missouri and Maine would be added as a free and a slave state, keeping the balance in the Senate equal, even though there were more representatives in the House. As long as the Senate was balanced, everything would be fine. Okay, and if you look at the map, you're going to see that the Missouri Territory, okay, the state of Missouri is going to be in yellow. Okay, an area north of, or all in the green, would be considered free states. That means slavery would not be admitted in those states. And all the territories south of Missouri, basically Arkansas and Florida, would be, when added, would be added as free states, or slave states, would be added as slave states. Again, it's a very difficult situation, but again, you can see that Missouri is a unique place, and slavery and the Missouri Compromise did solve or did delay the argument over slavery for many, many years. Okay. Later on, after or just before the Mexican War, we talked about the Mexican War and the U.S. wanting to buy, again, the territory to the west of Texas. There was an idea about purchasing this land for about $2 million, and part of the process was a guy named was called the Wilmot Proviso, and this Congressman Wilmot decided he wanted to outlaw slavery. He's an anti-slavery guy, and he wanted to get rid of slavery and didn't want to allow it in the West. So he proposed this it was called the Wilmot Proviso, which said that slavery would be forbidden and obtained by the U.S. with the money they were going to use to purchase it from Mexico. It passed the House, but again, the Senate, because it's a very southern-leaning society and it was pretty much balanced, the Senate defeated it and kept defeating, even though Wilmot Proviso came up over and over again. It still didn't match, and it didn't become a law, but it did become a basis for debate over slavery in the territories as we move on towards the 1850s and 1860s. So again, the Wilmot Proviso is talked about, but it really didn't do anything. It simply just said, guys, we want to outlaw slavery, but this, again, it couldn't get past the Senate and never made it to the president's desk to be signed. But again, it does create a area of debate in the issue of slavery in the territories. That moves us to the Compromise of 1850. Now, we talk about the Compromise of 1850 because it did a lot of things. Okay, they wanted to end this debate over slavery for once and for all. Okay, and again, it really caused more problems than it solved. Okay, you can see there's 4 measures in the Compromise of 1850. Okay, the concessions to the South, North authorized the abolition. Okay, to the North was the abolition of slave trade in the District of Columbia. Now, again, slaves could be bought and sold anywhere in the South with the exception of Washington, D.C., because, again, they wanted to make sure, because Washington is the capital, and our Constitution says, Declaration of Independence talks about all men are created equal, and we talk about the idea that, under the Bill of Rights, that, the first 10 amendments, all the freedoms. So they kind of had to do that in the District of Columbia. California is going to be added as a free state, even though there was a debate in California about dividing the state in 2 and creating Northern California would be a free state and Southern California would be considered a slave state. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, slavery did exist in Southern California, and even though it wasn't a big issue, California was eventually going to be added as a free state. Third thing is a fugitive slave law of 1850, which provided that runaway slaves could be returned to their masters. Now, the big thing here is it made it a crime to not help slave catchers. manhunters, if you will, capture slaves. And this becomes a real big issue in the North because, again, many Northerners were abolitionists, especially in New York. Remember, Frederick Douglass was living in Rochester, and Harriet Tubman was living in Rochester. And, so the whole idea of Northerners being forced to assist in the capture of slaves, runaway slaves, was not a good thing, and it wasn't really greeted well by a lot of Northerners, and there's going to be a lot of protest over this. In fact, some places like Syracuse, New York, they actually ran slave catchers out of town on a rail when they tried to capture runaway slaves. The fourth part of this whole thing is Texas is going to be added to the Union, which was already added as Union as a slave state. It's going to be given a lot of money to take care of some of its old debt. And Texas, again, remember when Texas was added, we talked about that just before the Mexican War. Texas had a huge amount of debt. And the big issue is going to be, what are we going to do with, their debt? And with the Compromise of 1850, all this debt is going to be forgiven. The government's going to pay off any bad claims, and Texas would be free to go on its way. The big thing was, again, actually resulted in a gradual intensification of hostility between the slave and free states. While we were supposed to solve a problem with slavery, and answer the question completely, it really didn't. It made the problem worse. And again, led to such people as John Brown and John Brown's raid and the murders, mass murders in the border wars that's going to take place in Kansas and Missouri during the 1850s. So this is a very big issue here in the United States. You can look here, as you can see, the 4 points of the Missouri Compromise 1850. California is added to the Union as a free state. Utah and New Mexico are created as free states, dealing with the idea of popular sovereignty. It outlaws the slave trade in the District of Columbia, and the fugitive slave law requires Northerners to return escaped slaves to their masters. You can see that there's a lot of problems here. And again, most Northerners are not going to be favorable to the Compromise of 1850. And a lot of Southerners weren't either. They just simply didn't agree with the situation. The next mistake along the way that led to more conflict is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law provided that two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, would be made from the Indian land west of the Missouri River and north of 37 degrees north latitude. Now, if you look at the map, up on the wall, you're going to see that it's a lot of territory, and it's right next door to Missouri. And Stephen Douglas, who was big into this whole thing, this whole idea of getting people, to solve their problems. He tried to negotiate, but again, he was really a pro-slavery guy. Introduced in Congress this bill with a provision for popular sovereignty. Now, if you look at this, popular sovereignty is allowed all the questions of slavery in new territories to be decided by the settlers. That means if you're going to have slavery in the state of Kansas or Nebraska, the people were going to vote. And this caused a really big problem. A lot of border wars when people from Missouri would storm into Kansas, and literally just rig the vote in terms of how to get slavery into Kansas. Again, this is where you see people like John Brown really become a advocate for the anti-slavery movement. John Brown is actually going to commit a mass murder. Him and his followers at Pottawatomie Creek, where they massacre a bunch of pro-slavery people, women, children, everybody. Also, pro-slavery people raid places like Lawrence, Kansas, which is the home of the anti-slavery movement in Kansas, and they burn their local newspaper, and they have all kinds of things go on. And it really puts these people in the state in a very difficult position because, again, most of the people who were living there didn't have enough property and enough wherewithal to really need slavery yet. But again, it was going to be a decision left to the people. And again, thank you to Stephen Douglas for creating this very difficult situation. And again, you can see that it nullified what was considered the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise, which basically said that there's no slavery west of or north of the southern border of Missouri, with the exception of Missouri. And so this gets rid of that whole idea. Again, it has a whole bunch of issues that we can discuss, and you'll see as we talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act later. But again, it's a big issue, and again, as you see at the bottom in big red letters, the Kansas-Nebraska Act might have hastened the American Civil War, because again, the issues and the people who came out of Kansas, Nebraska, were people like John Brown and Harriet Beecher Stowe and all her family, who were very anti-slavery and were shipping guns and everything to Kansas in boxes marked Bibles, and we'll talk about what they were often referred to as Beecher's Bibles, which were guns. So, but that's the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Quickly, as you can see, our next little issue is the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was a slave. He was owned by an Army officer who traveled all over the place. And when this Army officer died, Dred Scott actually sued, had some friends who they went to court, and they sued because for Dred's freedom, because they said that Dred had lived in free territory, and the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And where Dred is going to lose because, again, blacks are not considered citizens. Thus, they were not allowed to sue in federal court. Again, he was property, like all slaves were. So Dred was property. Okay, and if you can, here's our next slide. Dred Scott versus Sandford. The Supreme Court recognized that dual federalism, in which separate but equally powerful levels of government were preferable, and the national government should not exceed its enumerated powers. The enumerated powers are Article 1, Section 8, which we talked about a long time ago. The listed powers of Congress basically says that the government cannot go beyond what's listed in those powers. Okay, the court held that Dred Scott was not a U.S. citizen and therefore not entitled to sue in court. The case was dismissed, and Scott was going to remain a slave. Okay, and Taney further wrote that Congress had no power to abolish slavery in the territories, and slaves were private property protected by the Constitution. And this declared the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. Really big thing, because again, not only did it create a group of people who couldn't be citizens, even if they were free. Okay? Even if they were free blacks, they were still not citizens. Okay? And that's a really big thing, because that eliminated the idea of citizenship and property ownership and voting rights, and made it real simple, if not necessary, to get rid of freed blacks by sending them out of the country to places like Africa. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Again, this is between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Okay, Stephen Douglas, we mentioned before during a couple of other slides. He is the senator from Illinois, and he's a pro-slavery guy. And again, these debates centered on the extension of slavery into the free territories. Throughout the debates, they talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They talked about slavery. Okay, Douglas defended the policy of Kansas-Nebraska because, remember, he introduced this whole idea of popular sovereignty. Okay, Lincoln argued the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision opened the way to slavery to enter all the territories. Remember, again, the Dred Scott decision had outlawed or had made slavery legal simply by saying that the Congress had no power to regulate it. So that was a big issue that comes out in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln regarded slavery as a moral, social, and political evil, and that was a huge difference between him and Douglas. But Douglas ignored the moral question of slavery simply because he knew that it was a lose-lose for him. Okay, so even though this whole debate went on, there were 7 of them. Okay, Douglas is going to be reelected, okay, as senator, and he's going to go on to serve in the Senate for another 12 years or so. But again, it was a big. These basically put Lincoln on a national stage and made way for Lincoln and the Republican Party, the creation of the Republican Party. And eventually Lincoln will be elected president in 1861, which ultimately leads to the American Civil War that's going to last from 1861 through 1865. Well, hope that helped a little bit. That was my brief run through of the PowerPoint. If you have any questions, again, just post them on Edmodo. Let me know what's going on. This is my first attempt at trying to do something like this, so give me a break. And I hope we had fun. And thanks a lot for everything, and we'll see you soon.